matrix. And the food matrix is to do with the structure of food. And I've got a scientist that's being interviewed on a podcast by Stephen Bartlett, and her name is Dr. Sarah Berry. She's a professor in the Department of Nutritional Sciences at King's College in London. And she's been doing a lot of research on this food matrix. So what I'm going to do is share little snippets from this, because it's a 2-hour podcast. I'm just going to do it over 15 minutes. Share you a few snippets and also dig into a little bit about how this can give you a fad-proof diet. All right, so I'm going to share my screen now. We'll play just a little bit of this video. And,
can you give me a little bit of an overview over what you've spent the last sort of 25 years of your career focusing on and understanding?
Yeah, so I've spent 25 years starting out in quite a specific area, looking at how diet impacts our cardiometabolic health. So by this I mean lots of factors related to cardiovascular disease, like type 2 diabetes, our cholesterol, our blood pressure, our inflammation. And then more recently, I've been looking at how actually we piece together all the complexity of who we are, what we eat, how we eat, into how that actually impacts how we respond to food and the healthfulness of a food. Most of my work's been done through running clinical trials, so randomized controlled clinical trials where I recruit various people, get them to eat various things, do loads and loads of different measurements and look at how a food or a nutrient or a diet might impact a particular health outcome. When we think about food, we need to think about it beyond the traditional way that we thought about food in terms of nutrients, back-of-pack labelling, fat, protein, fibre, carbohydrate, but actually thinking about food in terms of the fact that on average each food has 70,000 different chemicals, and these are contained within a very complex food structure, which we call food matrix, that modulates the impact that those chemicals and nutrients have.
Okay, so just a little bit on that. That's a fascinating thing, and I don't know if you realise this, but what she's saying is the average food has 70,000 different chemicals. And we often just think of food as fats, carbohydrates and proteins. But there's so many chemicals, even just the antioxidants alone. You've heard of vitamin C and phenols probably, but there's over 800 antioxidants alone. There's dozens and dozens of other categories of nutrients in food. So this is just, that opens up a really huge Pandora's box, I guess, of possibilities when it comes to nutrients in food. So we'll carry on here.
What is the food matrix, and why do I need to know about that?
So the food matrix, simply put, is the structure of food. And it's really important because we know that food is so much more than just the nutrients and chemicals it contains. So we know that food contains nutrients that people are very familiar with, like protein, fat, fibre, carbohydrate. We know that food also contains thousands of other chemicals. Many of these we call bioactives that you'll have heard of, like polyphenols, vitamins, minerals, etc. But they're all encapsulated within the structure of a food. So think of an apple versus apple puree versus apple juice. And the reason it's important is because we know that food structure modulates the healthfulness of the chemicals and nutrients within the food. We're now eating.
Yeah, that's another really important point, is the structure of the food modulates how the nutrient value of that food is accessed by the beings that eat the food. So when we think of human beings and animals, I guess the food kingdom and the food that's been provided or designed, maybe it's been designed, or by nature, the food has become suitable for the animals and for the human beings that are consuming that food. So is it by design that the food is fashioned in a particular way by nature for our bodies to consume? I think so. I think that makes perfect sense. Even if you believe in things that have evolved to work together in an ecosystem, for example, particular foods have been made available to particular animals, but also they are packaged in such a way that the nutrients are in a form that our body needs, in a natural form. So she'll expand on this a bit further, but I think that's a really important point.
A lot of food where the food matrix, the structure of the food, has changed. And this is because we use multiple different processing techniques. So we use techniques like grinding, or we might use pasteurization for dairy, or extrusion for some carbohydrate-rich foods. We use all of these different techniques that also change the food matrix. But when we think about the healthfulness of a food, we need to think about it in terms of the processing techniques that have been used, as well as the nutrient composition. We can't look at them in isolation, in my opinion. And this is what I've done a lot of research looking into. And there's great research that has been looking at how processing can affect your eating rate, the energy density of food, the nutrient profile of a food. All of these first three foods, the crisps, the chocolate, the cookies, if compared to what would be a healthy food, they've all got less fibre. They've all got, well, certainly the chocolate and the cookie has got more sugar. They won't have all of the wonderful bioactives in them. And then with the crisps, depending on the type of crisp, it's probably quite high in salt. But the chances are with those three is that they are quite energy dense, so they have quite a lot of calories per gram, which is partly because of the processing techniques. Yet if you take a whole food, like a nut, now they're actually very energy dense. So they're very high in fat, they're high in calories, but actually because they're in their original food matrix, how your body handles them is quite different to if, for example, they had been processed. On average.
So let's just stop there again. If food's been processed, then a lot of that food matrix is broken down. So the food matrix is basically the structure of the food. And if the structure of the food has been destroyed by processing, and so many different ways that food's processed in factories, like having the husks taken off and being milled down and homogenized into, basically compounding the food into something that's nowhere near resembles the original food as it comes in nature. And what that does is it means that your body has instant access to far more of the nutrients in the food. And that's okay when it comes to really, really healthy nutrients, which we'll talk about in a minute. But what we're talking about in most of these foods, especially snack foods, is just purely salt, sugar, fat. And oftentimes it's artificial or man-made or altered structures of these even simple carbohydrates, sugars, fats, and even proteins. They're often altered in the process of manufacturing. And so not only are we getting huge amounts of these nutrients available, but they're huge amounts of denatured nutrients, which are not good for your body at all. Right, let's carry on.
I would say it takes about 10 to 20 minutes for the fullness to really properly kick in. Now, you could easily have got through those. Well, I could easily have got through all of these in under that 20 minutes. It doesn't take 20 minutes for all of the fullness signals to kick in, because as soon as you start chewing something, you start to release different hormones, and different sensory characteristics of the food will also trigger some sort of fullness. But what we do know is that you have more of these fullness receptors saying, hey, you're full, lower down in your gastrointestinal tract. And so if you can get food to the lower gastrointestinal tract, that's when it says, hey, Stephen, you're full now. And these heavily processed snacks that you've got here would be typically absorbed higher up the gastrointestinal tract, because kind of the hard work's been done. And yet when you've got something like a whole grain or a nut, typically that would be absorbed lower down the gastrointestinal tract, where you've got more of these fullness signals, so giving you that greater feeling of fullness. We now know that
So let's just talk to that a little bit, because this is a really important point as well, is that the processed food doesn't make you feel full. So even though you might be getting a huge amount, 3, 4, 5 times the amount of the sugars, the fats, and the simple starches and the carbs and stuff that you really don't want to overload on, but you're not feeling full on them. So as you know, you could probably sit down and eat a huge big bag of potato chips or popcorn or biscuits, eat a whole packet of biscuits and still not really feel full. And that's because they're absorbed high up in the system, because they're so processed and quickly absorbed. Whereas try sitting down and eating a bag of carrots or half a dozen apples, and you can see the difference right away. That in fact, when you're eating whole food that comes with its natural food matrix, you feel fuller quicker because you've got to chew on it a lot more. It takes longer to eat. And so by the time you get through the first apple, the apple is already starting to go down in your gut further for more digestive breakdown. And that causes you to feel fuller faster. And you have far less of the processed, denatured, calories and fats and sugars in your digestive system. And so much, much healthier. And that really explains why it's such an important thing if you want to go on a cleanse or a weight loss program, is to have whole, unprocessed food. And this really explains why. Let's carry on.
Weight's important. There's some fantastic work that's being done by a Professor Kieran Ford, who's dedicated many years into researching this and looking at how changing the structure and texture of the food can modulate your eating rate, and how also your eating rate can modulate how you metabolize the food and how many calories you go on to eat. The research that's been done by Kieran Ford shows that on average, if you change the speed in which you eat your food by about 20%, you reduce your calorie intake by about 15%. And there's even been clinical trials where they get groups of individuals and say, okay, slow down the rate at which you eat your food over the next, 3, 4, 5 weeks. They have another group, they say, just eat at your normal rate. Those people who are intentionally slowing down the rate at which they eat their food lose more weight than those people who continue to eat at their normal rate. So there's some great research that's been...
Sorry, I'll stop it there again, because that's just one more point to make, and a little trick that you can use if you're wanting to cleanse or detox or lose weight, is to use something that will force you to eat slower. In other words, a smaller fork or a smaller spoon, or even use a smaller plate, so that your meal, it seems like still seems like a larger meal, but because it's on a smaller plate, it's actually not. And use a smaller spoon and a smaller fork. And the other thing you can do to slow down your eating rate, like you're saying, if you eat slower, you get fuller faster and you feel less hungry, is to chew your food until it's like an absolute puree in your mouth. And in other words, don't leave any little particles whole as you swallow, and spend that time chewing, and that'll really slow down your eating rate. So great tip. The slower you eat, the less calories your body will absorb, require, and also the fuller you'll feel, the faster. Great information.
That shows that heavily processed, soft textured type food can be eaten 50% more quickly than the unprocessed, harder textured equivalent. So the kind of food that we're eating now is quite different. So you're eating it really quickly, you're overeating because your hunger signals haven't got there. Now, over the last 10 years, done lots of studies with nuts, with oats, for example, that demonstrate you can have two foods that have identical back-of-pack labelling, identical nutrients, identical calorie value, if you were to look at the back-of-pack labelling, but can have entirely different impacts in terms of how much energy you absorb, how you metabolize that food, how it impacts your hunger, how it impacts downstream health effects. So we looked at this.
Okay, so unprocessed whole food has a completely different effect on your body when you eat it, as far as the nutrient value. Basically what she's saying is eat whole foods, eat unprocessed food, which is something we've been talking about for many decades when it comes to the health of the body. Is really the golden rule. Even on a weight loss diet or a detox diet, the golden rule is to eat unprocessed whole foods. And so some of these processed foods, I think something she hasn't mentioned, which is a couple of nutrients that they are really lacking in, and is particularly fibre, but the other one is water. And so, when you're hungry, quite often a glass of water will take that hunger away, because it's actually thirst and not hunger. And most processed food, apart from maybe some smoothies and juices, are very low in water, and the water's been taken out. So there might be a fruit or vegetable component, but largely it's processed down into starch and sugar and fat, and there's not much water. And water is something that you get in all whole foods. Most whole foods contain 95 to 99% water. And water is the thing that we need the most of, and water is the thing that we're most deficient in. Most of us are dehydrated, and that's a massive nutrient that is only really available in whole foods or unprocessed food, especially fruit and vegetables. Right, let's just look at the last little bit.
our cohort of 1,000 individuals, where we've taken lots of measures related to what they're eating, when they're eating, how they're eating it, as well as lots of different health outcomes. And what we found was that the frequency of eating within reason was not a problem. So if people were grazing, having multiple eating events, as long as they were eating healthy foods, it didn't matter having multiple eating events. So snacking per se wasn't a problem as long as they were healthy foods. And we found that if you snack late at night...
I feel attacked.
And this is a lot in line with, other published research from very tightly controlled clinical trials. We found that if you snack late at night, that was associated with unfavourable health outcomes. So worse adiposity, so worse kind of fat around your belly, for example, higher levels of inflammation, worse levels of blood lipids, so, cholesterol, that sort of thing. And we found that this was even if you were snacking on healthy snacks.
Really?
And this isn't especially surprising because there's this whole new area in nutrition called chrononutrition, which is all about the timing of eating. And we now are really starting to understand that every cell in our body has its little body clock, has a clock. Every cell has a clock. And that clock is shaped by when we eat as well as the light-day cycle. And if we're eating out of sync with those clocks, those millions and trillions of clocks in our body, we know that we process the food slightly differently, we metabolize it slightly differently, and it may have a different impact on our health. And that's what our research showed as well. So eating after 9 o'clock isn't great for your health. There's some really fascinating research that came out about 1 or 2 years ago, where they looked at giving exactly the same calories and foods over the day within the same time period, but in one group of individuals having most of the calories earlier, and in another group having most of them later in the day. Now, those that were having them later in the day woke up feeling more hungry, which is kind of like counterintuitive, isn't it? But it fits in with what you just said. Yet those people who were eating the calories earlier in the day woke up feeling less hungry.
So that's the last little bit there. It's really interesting that intermittent fasting has taken off around the world in recent years, and when you think about what she's saying there, the chrono eating, or the eating at certain times of day, and eating it earlier is better, and rather than later, especially after 9 p.m. So what I'd suggest doing is intermittent fasting, if you're looking to maintain your metabolism and your weight, is eating between maybe 10 and 6 or 11 and 7 at the latest. So snack during the day after 11, and then have your main meal straight after work, maybe at 6 p.m, 7 p.m. at the latest, and then stop eating after that, and you're onto a good thing. But what I recommend doing is look at the QR code there, check out the page and the link to the fad-proof diet. That's it's sort of a combination of all the best things you can do to look after your health long term with diet. So thanks for watching again, and we'll talk to you soon. Thanks again. Bye.